So you grew up during the 50s and 60s, not really a time when women, and certainly not a time when Native Americans had role models in poetry as a life path. I read you said this about your calling, that it was the spirit of poetry who reached out and found me as I stood there at the doorway between panic and love. When did you know that poetry was your way in?
That was a shock, just like being named the U.S. Poet Laureate, because I was into painting and art like my grandmother, my Aunt Lois Harjo, and the idea of speaking in public or even writing my voice down was horrifying. My stepfather stole my journal and started reading passages out, and I decided I would never write. I would not write anything down. But I was a student at the University of New Mexico. We were involved in Native rights movements and human rights, and there was women's rights. And at the same time, I realized later I was having a breakdown, but I did not have the luxury of having a breakdown because I had 2 young children, and there would have been no one. I had been banished from my home for speaking the truth. So I had to walk through it. And it was around that time I was listening to, there were all of these multicultural poetry gatherings, and I was listening to poetry of Native, and it was the first time I heard Native poets. And I thought, wow, we can write about our lives and they can be in poetry. And I loved poetry before that, but it switched to something that was something I admired from a distance to something that was something that I could participate in. And I started writing, and I wrote my way through that because I found in words were like the materials, just like all the different colors of these flowers. And that became my palette instead of paintbrush or color.
But what's so interesting is there was this moment when you were 8 years old when you were given the first poetry book. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I wanted books of poetry, and my mother loved poetry, and she wrote song lyrics. But when I was asked what I wanted, I said, I want books. And my mother gave me this golden book of poetry. Louis Untermeyer was one of the editors. And I liked that all the voices were different.
Yeah. I love that you wrote, it was singing on paper.
Yes.
Yes. And so that was your first realization that poetry spoke to you in a way.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about your upbringing. You tell the story in Crazy Brave that is a true wonder that, number one, you survived your childhood and your upbringing, not to mention to survive it and now to be literally held in such acclaim as the America's poet. So you write on page 53, this is a moment when your father was coming in and was angry all the time. And you said, it will never be right as long as you are angry. I wanted to say, but who was I to say? Because I was a child. And because I was a child, I cowered under the table to hide. When he started coming my way in anger, my cowering made him even angrier because I was not brave at all. My father would get angry. He would get angry because his mother died of tuberculosis when he was a baby, because his father beat him, because he was treated like an Indian man in lands that were stolen away, along with everything else. So how did that color your view of yourself?
Well, I always felt bad that I didn't stand up. I've always felt that he would have respected me more if I had stood up and fought him. But then I remember I did try to fight him when he would go at my mom. And that I was too small.
But you were just a kid.
Right, but you still.
Being traumatized by all of this, yes. When did you realize that those were traumatizing events that you as a child had no control over?
I think I'm still realizing that. Oklahoma was the land we were moved to. It was called Indian Territory, from our lands in the Southeast. And it wasn't that long ago. I think a lot of people think history was something that happened a long time ago. But if you count generations, it was just a few grandfathers ago, a few grandmothers ago, when we were rounded up and moved illegally from our homelands in the South.
And so your father had all of that rage of having the land taken away, all of that rage of being consistently disrespected and held in not high regard,
Hmm.
and now trying to raise a family on very little.
Well, suddenly he had 4 children, and I don't know. I've always tried to understand him because I think, I carry a lot of him
Hmm.
with me.
Hmm.
I try to understand, even though, I get angry at him still sometimes, even though I've forgiven him and he's come and talked to me and said he's proud of me.
Hmm. Come to talk to you in the spirit.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yes,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
One reason it's very difficult. That was very difficult to write because in my work, I like to transform. I like to walk through history
Mhm.
and this amazing garden of living and transform what is ugly into something that will feed us and nourish us.
Mhm.
And to have to write, and I felt like I needed to because there were people going through that. There were women going through that. There were Native women going through that. People going through those moments, and then we carry them with us, and they keep us from being who we were meant to be.
Yeah. Especially when I think about your stepfather, horrible person.
Yeah.
What happened to him that caused him to be so mean and horrible?
I didn't want to go to his funeral,
Mhm.
and but I went to support my mother, and I sat out in the car with his daughter, my stepsister, who was a lot like a mother to me. She was close to
Mhm.
my mother's age, and I wanted to know what happened, how he got that way, because there's always a story, and there's usually a story, some kind of sordid story of abuse.
Yes.
And she said that he used to, his mother spoiled him rotten, and that's another kind of abuse.
Yeah.
And then his father would drink every weekend, pull out guns, which must have been terrifying, and shoot around in the house and the roof. And he would be seen the next morning up on the roof, patching the holes that his father had shot on the roof.
Yes. And so that can send you both ways. It could send you to be a more loving and compassionate person because you grew up with that, or to turn out to be the kind of man he was to you and your brothers and sisters. So I don't want to dwell on it, but I just want people to have an idea of the kind of background you came from. I love this moment where you talk about your mother separated from your birth father. And then this man started to court her because your mother was beautiful.
Yeah, she
She
was
she
very
had
beautiful.
the combination of being Native American and
European.
European,
Yeah.
and the thing that people consider dazzling and exotic, your
Yeah.
mother was. And so she attracted men easily,
Uh-huh.
and obviously knew that, right?
Yeah.
That she was beautiful. And this man did everything in his power to woo the family, buying you all treats and sodas and,
Yeah.
being the kind of person who's going to show you that I love you and I love your kids. And then once he got her to say yes to marrying him, and you all moved away, you knew instantly, you knew immediately. The knowing helped you to know that you were headed to a dark place. Tell us how.
Well, kids are really good at feeling out people.
Yeah. You know when I knew?
Yeah.
Is when you said, I think the line was, he married our mother without the children present. So your mother has all
Yes.
these children, and the children aren't involved in the wedding or at all. So he didn't care about that. Yes.
And our whole life changed.
Yes.
Because our life with our mother and even with our father there was always music. We had musicians at our house.
Yes.
And my parents loved to dance. It's one of my
Yes.
favorite things. And that was our home. But with him in the house, all the music went away.
Yes. Just to bring people in a bit to the crazy brave phenomena. When you even pulled up to the house, the spirit of the house spoke to you in a way that you knew that terrible things were going to happen in that house, is what you say.
Yes. And my mother was mowing the yard before we moved in. And she said, the yard was filled with snakes. That's a sign of someone who is evil. And then I asked my mother again, she has her own knowing, and she had a very strong knowing that this is not a good thing. And I said, then why are we coming here? And I learned later it was because, of the threats.
He had threatened her.
Yes.
Yeah. He had threatened her and said, I will kill you and I'll kill your children.
Right.
Yes. And all that. I think there's nothing worse than being humiliated, and certainly humiliated in front of other people. You were keeping a journal. You shared a bit of this earlier, and also in the book, that he found your journal and was reading out loud your journal in front of the entire family just to embarrass you.
Right.
Yeah. And then you auditioned for play, and he said you cannot be in the play, and
right, for no reason. But you find ways to cope. You find ways to.
Then you always coming around too, and
he was always kind of. I was the one that he kind of zeroed in on. Yeah.
But you got out.
I did. I did.
That was a saving grace. So you were in your early 20s, a single mother of two, working and attending college full time at the University of New Mexico when you changed your major from pre-med to poetry. That's quite a left turn.
Yes and no.
Yes. Everybody in your life told you you were foolish at the time. They questioned how you would make a living. Everybody said you should become a teacher. What gave you the inner faith to stick with your passion? Did you ever waver?
It was that sense of this is what I had to do. And it surprised me because when poetry came to me, it was in the middle of what was like a breakdown, and where no one knew, because I could always move through. Nobody knew what was going on. And I had to count every breath. I had to count steps.
This is when you were having the panic attacks.
Yes, and I would walk across. I had to get my kids, I had to see to them, and nobody knew. And it was then I started.
Because you had a son.
I had a
already,
son and a daughter.
And then rain came.
Rainy came. And it was that poetry. And I found something in writing poetry that I had not found in painting. There was something compelling, and I don't know exactly what it was, because I had no idea I didn't grow up with like a poet down the street or, poets in my, they were people from long ago usually.
Yes.
But there was something so compelling, and I found that I could write about what was going on with Native women, with what we were going through in these times of fighting for our rights, trying to speak out and say, we are here. We're over 500 tribal nations, and we are here, and we're thriving, and we're human beings. We are human beings. There was a study done by Illuminative recently, this organization that collected data on what Americans think about natives. And would you know that a large percentage of Americans still believe that we're not human?
Really? In the United States of America today?
Yes.
Well, we of the African American culture went through this in our history also, where there was a law that said you were not human. I did not know that was true also of Native Americans. Yes. How did you feel recently when Governor Newsom of California made an apology to the Native American people, particularly of California, saying that what happened in the state of California was nothing less than genocide?
Well, it's important I applaud him for making that apology. And then what are the next steps?
Yeah, what does that actually mean? Yeah. What would you like it to mean?
Some kind of, the acknowledgement. What are reparations, that you get the whole state, state back, or some kind of acknowledgement? I would ask the California Native people what they would, what it is that they would want.
What does that mean? Yeah. So
listening into that place where the man that you adore and love is coming at you. It's not often easy. It's not easy. I don't know that any path is of being a human being. But so in order to do that, it is a kind of a path of a mystic, because a mystic is looking into the spiritual realm of being. And it is a kind of path. In a way, I think all humans are, but mystics are more focused on that.
Yeah.
And poetry is, if you're writing poetry, you go into that. I feel like, though, I'm like the hammer and nails, because I'll be writing along, it's something really cool, and it's like, whoa, I never heard that before. Okay. And then I'm fitting in, there's all this other stuff that's not so. And then it's a process. You can see the process when someone is carving something
or painting,
but that same kind of process goes on when you're writing poetry.
Wow. The Librarian of Congress said Your work powerfully connects us to the earth and the spiritual world with direct, inventive lyricism that helps us reimagine who we are. You are connected to the spiritual world. Do you see yourself
Yes.
as
Oh,
being
of
connected to the
course.
spiritual world?
Of course. This
You
is
do.
the spiritual world.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're just human. We're just having a human experience.
That's right.
Yes. Yeah. One thing I know for sure is that, and I talk about this with all of our Super Soul guests, I know for sure that we're all connected.
Mm-hmm.
And part of these conversations is to help people to have those realizations for themselves. And you explain that by calling it the story matrix. Can you tell us what that means, the story matrix?
One time in a dream, and my dreams are some of them are just ordinary dreams, and some go to another place, and I travel in them. And in this dream, one of my guardians took me, and we stood at the edge of this realm looking. And you could see all of this energy. It's like it's all energy. It's like all music, so to speak. It's all energy, and it's moving. You could see all of the stories, too, all of the stories of everyone. You could hear everyone's voices and said,
wow.
And the spirit didn't have to say anything. I was just watching. And then you could see that there was a luminosity, even in the midst of the most horrible things. There is a luminosity that connects all of us. It connects everything, so that everyone, even my stepfather, is a luminous being. We get lost. It doesn't mean that I still have a quarrel with him, but I don't want to be attached to him forever. You know, I don't want to be around, but it means sort of stepping back. And then there's also another place. If you step back farther, there's even more. And you step back farther and you start to see that there is no such thing as time, that really we're all stories. That ultimately, that's what I come to believe after this and other times where I've seen this, is that there's not a sequential hierarchy of reincarnation. Rather, in a way, we realize that we're all stories. That your story is mine. The story of these plants here. This is my story too. The stone. The stone is my story too. And so, it's in a way, I think, and I could be wrong. This is just what is that we become all stories, and that's when we realize we remember who we are.
That's beautiful. I'm trying to see how my story is the stone story, but I can get there. I can get there.
The stones are a little more slowed down to our way of moving. It's a little different.
Yeah, a little. Yeah, the energy's different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's slowed down, so they see much more deeply in a way. They see in a way, I consider stones like they hold, they anchor, but we need them.
Yeah, I get it, because everything has its own energy field.
Yeah.
I'm not enlightened enough to get it with the stones, but I really get it with the trees.
Yes.
Like, trees have their own language for me. Yes, they do. So in American Sunrise, you write that your grandfather was driven from his land near what is now Dadeville, Alabama. He never returned, but you did. And you write, I returned to see what I would find in these lands we were forced to leave behind. You also wrote a poem about that experience, which spans over 16 pages in the book. Could you read the first stanza to us?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
This poem is called Exile of
Memory.
Thank you. And the poem came from, we returned, my husband, who's also my tribe, the Muskogee Creek people, and we returned to the Southeast for a job, but we wanted to be there to go around to the homelands and to see what had happened. And I was standing there, we were thinking about leaving, and I said, I asked the trees, I said, what did I learn here? And this whole book came. Do not return, we were warned by one who knows things. You will only upset the dead. They will emerge from the spiral of little houses lined up in the furrows of marrow and walk the land. There will be no place in memory for what they see. The highways, the houses, the stores of interlopers perched over the blood fields. where the dead last stood. And then what? You with your words and the enemy's language. Do you know how to make a peaceful road through human memory? And what of angry ghosts of history? Then what?
Then what? And so it just came to you. This just came to you.
Yes.
Yeah. And the process is what? It's like what? Does it all come at one time?
You had to write a poem all at once in one sitting, so I would sit there all day until I got it pretty close. But it's different. And this poem I revised, this book I have revised more than any other. I have gone back, and maybe in a way it's like coming into contact with history, because the poems connect me with that love.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
So last year, the CDC reported that American Indians, as well as Alaskan Natives, have the highest rates of suicide of any racial or ethnic group in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And according to the U.S. Census, nearly 30% of Native Americans live in poverty. You once said that my poems are about confronting the kind of society that would diminish Native people, disappear us from the story of this country. Do you find that too is a part of your calling?
Of course it is. Of course it is. You know, I was thinking about, people ask, well, what am I going to do in this position? Well, what can poetry do? And poetry gives us a way to speak. It gives us a way to at least express our thoughts so we can find pathways to healing.
Mm-hmm.
And healing is not, it's not not always a pretty thing.
No.
You have to go through the wound. You have to, sometimes you got to go back several times. And, you know, the suicide, that's, you know, missing and murdered women, epidemic. You know, where there's even the way the laws are now that, you know, non-natives can go, and this happens a lot in our community. They will come onto the community and rape and abuse our young Native women, and then they can't be prosecuted because they're non-natives. We cannot prosecute them.
To this day.
To this day. And so all of my poetry was born out of a sense of trying to be helpful in the way that I know how. I have words. Sometimes I have words, music's in the words, sometimes I have music. Mm-hmm. But that is the way that I can come to helping, to help change, or to help, you know, any young person, you know, who the suicide rate in the whole country is epidemic, because the young don't feel connected. They feel, even though the internet supposedly connects you with everything, it does not. It does not connect you with your soul. And poems speak to the heart. They go to the soul or the gut or the heart of it.
Right.
And poetry can be there. It's often a poem, you know, a poem that will lead us, you know, out of despair. Because we go to poetry when there's a birth, when there's death, marriage, when we're falling in love, when we're falling out of love, when we want to praise this, you know, out of gratitude for these beautiful gifts that we've been given on this journey. Or we want to not praise, you know. Mm-hmm. That's also part of the story.
Yeah. I use it to calm myself, actually. Uh-huh. Yeah, I find it as a regulating, calming mechanism.
Yeah.
It is like music to the soul. So it must be especially harrowing for you to witness what still goes on in your community, and also to look at what's happening to children and families at the American border with Mexico.
That's one of the biggest crimes.
It is.
And we have to do something about it, because, you know, we're all being held accountable.
You say our country is in great need of deep healing, and I agree. The Washington Post described your poetry as medicine for the whole nation. And you were just saying it can be a healing force. You told the New York Times that we're at a very crucial time in American history and in planetary history. Poetry is a way to make bridges from one country to another, one person to another, one time to another. How do we heal as a nation, as a planet?
Well, that's a big...
I know it's big. You know,
that is a huge question. It's about listening. I mean, because if we listen, then we can hear all of that vibration, that movement in the luminosity between everyone. If we knew that we were connected, there would not be the divisiveness in the nation. If we understood the way those Muskogee Creek and Native elders had taught us that we are all part of each other, that everyone is related, and that all the children are our children.
Yeah, you would
They're
know that
all our
those are your children. You're doing that to your children.
Those are our relatives.
That's right.
There is no border.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. There's another poem in American Songwriters, Singing Everything. I love this line from it. You write, "You must be friends with silence to hear." That's why I love being here in Maui, so because it's so still sometimes that you can hear your own heart beating. But this whole fundamental idea of you must be friends with silence to hear. Tell us what you mean by that.
That line has been years and years in coming. Because as much poetry has been a really big teacher, because my mind is constantly, I have a mind that is constantly analyzing and working. And I know it doesn't look that way, but it is always going. And I've had to learn how to stop and listen. And that can be the hardest thing, especially in a time when you feel there's so much to do in this world. There's so much, and there's family, and there's, I feel, young families out there, people trying to make a living and dealing with it, just basics. And we're not given time to listen. I mean, everybody's got earbuds in, we've got our cell phones. If we stop and listen, then we're going to realize maybe that's you realize what we're in. And so the history would be so much different rather than coming in with flags and guns and saying, you're not a human being.
Yeah, and violating entire cultures.
Yes.
Yes. So many of your poems are so stirring. Would you read Remember from your collection called She Had Some Horses?
Okay.
Do you remember them?
Some of them I know I can do by memory. And then this one I'll do. Yeah, this is Remember. And remember the sky you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon, know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are, red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember you are all people and all people are you. Remember that you are this universe and this universe is you. Remember that all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember language comes from this. Remember the dance that language is. Remember.
Thank you, Joy Harjo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really, really, really love that.
The native peoples of this country have always shared a connection to its land, to its waters, to its spirit. We share the responsibility of protecting it, and we stand united in that commitment. We stood united in the face of adversity and adapted to serve the land in new ways. We stood united when we were told to move on, that our voices did not count. We fought and continue to fight for change. We continue to make our voices heard because we are still here. Our traditions are still strong. Our vote is our voice, and every native vote counts.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to invite you to be a part of our final discussion of the Joy and the Joy Harjo Book Club. Excited to be finishing up our celebration of 50 years at the Chief Seattle Club. This is a wonderful organization that I am lucky to be the executive director of. I am Colleen Echohawk, an enrolled member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. I also belong to the Upper and Athabascan people in rural Alaska, Montasa Lake. Shout out to Montasa Lake and Pawnee, Oklahoma for anyone out there watching. And it has been a wonderful time together. Last Wednesday, we had the U.S. Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo, in conversation with Tracy Rector, arts influencer and wonderful friend of the Chief Seattle Club. And today we get to digest a little bit of what we heard from Joy Harjo. We get to think a little bit about what it means in our world today that we're experiencing, how it relates to our work at the Chief Seattle Club, how it relates to our just general Seattle environment right now. You know, we're in a very special time. Our election is just around the corner, and we have a lot of work ahead of us in the way that we see our homeless community, the way that we work together as a community. So we're excited that you're here. I just want to acknowledge that we are so honored to partner with the Seattle Public Library. The Seattle Public Library has always been a home for our relatives. We know that many of our homeless community find a sense of security and stability in our public libraries. And we are just really honored to partner with the Seattle Public Library, to partner with Misha Stone, who will lead our discussion in a few moments. So just a big hands raised to Seattle Public Libraries. We also want to honor our sponsors of this event, Zillow. We also have Comcast as a sponsor, and of course the wonderful Seattle Kraken, which we're all looking forward to. There's just something exciting about the Kraken coming to Seattle. I think that in this time of COVID response and this pandemic, it's just really nice to look forward to something really fun coming our way here in Seattle. So thank you to all of our sponsors. And I want to thank our staff and our folks from Skybear Media who've helped put this together. So lots to come, and we want to invite you to be with us for the next hour as we discuss Joy Harjo's book and her poetry and what she shared with us last Wednesday. So I'd like to invite the wonderful Misha Stone to join us from Seattle Public Library, who has been a wonderful partner in this work together. And Misha, I'm just so honored that you're with us and looking forward to a wonderful conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. I also just want to hold space for this, just even watching Joy Harjo in conversation with Oprah, and upon reflection of her visit with Chief Seattle Club and Tracy Rector, there's just so much richness. I know that we will cover a lot of beautiful ground in the next hour. So joining us today is our special guest, Marcie Sillman. So I wanted to introduce Marcie. Marcie Sillman is an award-winning arts writer based in Seattle. Her work has been featured on NPR and the BBC. She has been a mainstay at KUOW, Seattle's NPR affiliate, since 1985, helping create and host the daily program's Weekday, a 2-hour forum for newsmakers, artists, and thinkers, and The Beat, Seattle's only broadcast program to focus specifically on arts and culture. During her career, more than 100 of her stories have been heard on NPR's news magazines, as well as on The Voice of America. Marcie is also the author of Out There, Jonathan Peretta's Life in Dance. Thank you so much for joining the Joy Harjo Book Club with Chief Seattle Club, Marcie.
Well, I thank both you and Colleen for including me in this conversation. I'm still kind of a little bit teary from the interview that we just watched before we went live, and thinking about the power of words and the power of poetry, especially this poetry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I just want to say thanks, Marcie, for being at this. I was like looking at my reflection, or looking at myself on the video while Misha was reading your description. I was like, oh, Marcie, I just appreciate you so much. And I have been a fan for over 20 years since I moved in Seattle, probably 22 years ago now. And I'm just such a fan. So I'm glad that you're with us, and I'm glad that we've become friends. And thank you for your support of the club and the work that we do.
Oh, it's very mutual.
Yeah, glad to see you. We could fawn over each other for a while,
Well,
but
we're not going to. We'll fawn over Joy Harjo instead.
yeah, exactly.
Well, Joy Harjo is who's bringing us together in her work, her body of work, and the connected themes that she brings forward in all of her work. So, just to let the audience know, we had a book discussion on An American Sunrise with Colleen, myself, and co-host Jossie Ross a couple of weeks ago, and then Joy Harjo came and spoke with Tracy Rector. And Marcie and I spoke a little bit before we got started. And one of the things I wanted to bring here today, because she brought this also forward in her talk last week, is that while we'll be talking about some of the poems from An American Sunrise, we'll also be talking about her memoir, Crazy Brave, and just her body of work, because she has been working through some of these same themes throughout all of her work. So we'll be talking for a little while and then taking Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions, please enter them into the chat, and Alicia will be kindly giving them to us when we get to that portion of our talk. So one of the places that I wanted to just start us to ground the discussion is to have Marcie read a poem that was meaningful to her. And I believe that Riley's going to get that up on the screen for us in a moment. And it's the poem Becoming 70.
And I'm only going to read part of it. It's actually quite a long poem. And as I round towards 70, I'm on the curve that way. This is one of many that spoke to me. So this is just the beginning of that poem, Becoming 70, and it's written for a friend, Marilyn Collette. We arrived when the days grew legs of night. Chocolates were offered. We ate latkes for hours to celebrate light and friends. We will keep going despite dark or a madman in a White House dream. Let's talk about something else, said the dog who begs faithfully at the door of goodwill. A biscuit will do. A voice of reason. Meat sticks. I dreamed all of this, I told her. You, me, and Paris. It was impossible to make it through the tragedy without poetry. What are we without winds becoming words? Becoming old children, born to sing us into love. Another level of love, beyond the neighbor's holiday light display, proclaiming goodwill to all men who have lost their way in the dark. I chose this poem because it resonates on so many levels for me, but I think also in the body of work and thinking about something that Joy said last week about being an older person and where that brings you. She writes so often about memory and ancestry and that kind of stream of life. And for me, this poem epitomized that. And it was about friendship, and it was about reclaiming or redefining things in a way that is certainly more positive, but definitely can be more healing. So that's one of the things I really appreciate overall in the body of her work, is that reclamation of a world that maybe hasn't always gone her way, and for a lot of us isn't necessarily going the way we would like it to be going right at this moment in time, as we're 6 days out from the election, right? You can't read this without thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am the oldest of 7 children. And so I had some of my younger siblings around a campfire in my backyard last night. And one of them was saying how afraid they feel about they just feel so afraid about what's coming. And I realize I'm much older than that sibling. And I realize, like, I don't feel afraid right now. Like, I feel a sense of real calmness, actually. And I think it's because of just my, I'm 44. And I have experienced life in a way, I have much more life behind me than my sibling. And I was thinking about the line at the bottom of page 87. I'm looking at my book. But without poetry, where are we without winds becoming worlds? And I love that line, because I can feel that in my experience, I have seen the winds become words. I have seen resiliency amongst our Native community. I've seen, the genocide that happened. And yet, despite that genocide, we have thriving Native people leading the community ahead. And I think that the Native community has something to offer the larger community right now. We have experienced some real hard times and have made it through.
I think that you hear that or read that if you read Crazy Brave, Joy's memoir, and she was talking a bit to Oprah about some of the experiences, but her youth was devastatingly personally hard. Her own ancestry, her grandfather, I believe, was one of the many people who was sent west from a homeland in Alabama. Not an unusual thing, but on the Trail of Tears. And so there's that ancestral sorrow, her personal sorrow. And then for me, because I spend my life talking to artists, the power that she found as a creative person and how those ties that she used that art, I guess, to tie herself both to the spirit world, to her ancestors, but also to that image of a river, right? A river is always running, a river is always carving its path forward. And in a sense, that's what these words do. That's what these poems do. I mean, her life is a symbol, and she's one of many people.
Yeah, I love that her life is a symbol. It's really true. And I know for me, like reading her memoir, there were so many times where I felt like sort of breathless, like, oh, wow, that happened. And then that happened. And these are hard things. And, my heart was just going out to her. And yet in the middle of that, she experienced basically revelation about, who she was as a Native woman and where she had come from and how it was guiding her. And later on, and we're going to talk about one of my favorite poem out of the book that talks about that guidance, that ancestral guidance. And people who know me will, they know I say that all the time. Like, I feel like my ancestors are pushing me in this direction. And so I'm following it. And I loved that, the whole book, American Sun and Rays, is really about ancestral guidance. It's one of the themes as she, explores her own traditional homelands and then moves into what it means to be urban. And there's just a tremendous amount of connection I feel with it as a Native woman.
I think it's also interesting. I think the collection of poetry also is it's beyond the story of a certain people or even one person. I'm not a Native person. I'm a second generation American. My relatives came here in the beginning of the 20th century, fleeing all kinds of violence and poverty. And yet that notion of where we find ourselves, what went before us, and how the lessons of resilience that we can take from it, I think, is what resonates for me. So there's a real universality in this writing. It's specific and universal. And I think I was speaking to somebody just yesterday about this very thing, that the very best art allows all of us access to a personal story. A personal story is personal, but a personal story is resonant. And in these times, Colleen, I take great joy in the fact that you feel centered and not afraid. But I think that the lessons that I take from Joy Harjo, but also that I take from the last 8 months of COVID, is to be patient and listen, is that we really have to have a much longer view than 21st century Americans are taught to have in mainstream culture, right?
Yeah.
And Joy Harjo said this beautifully in her talk last week with Tracy Rector, that being older and gaining some of the experiences and the things that she has gone through as a Native woman has put her now, she sees herself as being in the deep end of the story. And what that means is sort of what you were invoking, Colleen, about having some perspective that maybe other people in your life may not have, learning from some of that. And also to bring it back to what Chief Seattle Club is doing, there's a poem she read last week that I feel like harkens to the poem you just read, Marcie. It's called For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth in Its Human Feet. And it ends this way. it ends with, now you can have a party. Invite everyone you know who loves and supports you. Keep room for those who have no place else to go.
Yeah.
Make a giveaway, and remember, keep the speeches short. Then you must do this. Help the next person find their way through the dark.
Yeah.
And that echoes some of the themes that come up in the poem you just read, Marcie, because it's, if you're not giving back and lifting up others, then what are you learning and what are you listening to? So I feel like her work also just connects us to each other and brings up the ways in which our stories are in a matrix and are connected.
It's interesting to think about. It's hard to, well, I guess I'll flip it around. It's hard to read this, divorced from the world as it's happening right now, this week, this moment in time. I guess what I am thinking about is that theme of love and that sort of overarching presence of loving yourself and trusting yourself and resilience. But, coming through my social media feeds have been a lot of little videos really urging, I guess, to counter the kind of very nasty rhetoric that's going on with messages of love, and that it sounds kind of trite and hippy dippy, and I confess I am a child of the late 60s, early 70s, so I do come out of that. But I think that there is a power in remembering and at least thinking about, in the poem I read, it's the love for a friend, but there's very much in this collection, there's a poem about washing her mother's body after her mother passed, and passing on that chain of love. And it's just a really interesting thing to think that something that seems so intangible can have actual power.
Yeah.
I'm hoping it has actual power, I guess.
I mean, I think that, the poem that you just read, it really is a love poem in many ways, right? Like, she dedicates it to her friend. There's all the beautiful, storytelling about community in this poem, about sitting and eating and enjoying each other's company. And she ends it about like, that we're here to feed them joy, Such a beautiful phrase, because that is what, when you sit down with your relatives, or you sit down with your friends and you're in that moment of eating and laughing and telling stories, you're feeding each other joy. And if we in this society right now need that so much with this pandemic, we're not allowed to do that, sitting and eating and all that. And I know that I personally miss that so much. My spirit is fed by that personal interaction and that around the dinner table feel. And it's very poignant right now.
Misha, go ahead. It reminded me of Chief Seattle Club and a center for bringing people together. And you're still doing that, watching the little video that went before we were introduced and seeing everybody in their masks, still gathering, still burning the sage and passing it to one another. That seems so powerful to me. It's small, but it's about making a center for connection. So that's how I think of what you do.
Oh, well, thank you. And it's true. I think that, one of the hardest things for us is that we have had to shut down our dining room at the Chief Seattle Club. Yeah. Just like many of us had to shut down like our gatherings with each other. So all of our food is being served outside, and people are just eating it on the sidewalk or wherever they might need to eat it. But and our all of our services are just so drastically changed. And Joy in her book talks about like going to Indian school and how she felt so like connected to who she was as a Native person. And that's part of what Chief Seattle Club does. And that's why there's so many around the country in urban centers. There's Indian centers like Chief Seattle Club. And that's because there's a desire to gather together as Native people, because there's so few of us left. And in this urban environment, it can also feel very isolating and to not have a place to be together. So that's been the hard part of this virus for us.
Yeah, I bet it's finding home. You might not have the physical place, but you have that connection with people. It's like the chosen family kind of thing as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, one of the questions I have for both of you, because one of the things Joy Harjo said last week is that poetry can hold some of the emotions, some of the histories that are otherwise unspeakable or really hard to contain. And one of the beautiful things about her work is that she moves you through the grief and trauma towards gratitude and perspective. I'm wondering how Joy Harjo's work has done that for the both of you.
You know, Misha, you froze up just when you were asking the question. Oh. Could you ask it again?
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's fine on my end. So, you know, the technical difficulties. Thank you for bearing with that.
Right when you were asking the question.
I was going to ask just how Joy Harjo's poetry, which moves through grief and trauma to gratitude, and how her poetry does that for you as you're reading it.
Marcie, go.
Oh, well, I just flipped to a poem. I could flip to any one of these poems, but it's a poem called Beyond. And I'm sorry, because we didn't print it up for you all. So I'm just going to read the first stanza. Misha, can I do that? Beyond sunrise, there's a song we follow. Beyond clouds, traveling with rain humped on their backs, lightning in their fists. Beyond the blue horizon where our ancestors appear bearing gifts, wrapped in blankets woven with sun and strands of scarlet time. For me, that's it's so evocative of, you know, that whole river idea. That for me, her imagery is really connected with the eternal in some sense. And I think that notion of grace, however you want to define it, I feel that really strongly in her work and in a lot of poets' works. I think poets are able to distill our emotions in words the best poets can. She's obviously one of the best poets, in a way that I can try to find that center of grace and peace, that I can, you know, go, okay, beyond these clouds, beyond these sorrows, beyond these cares, you know, there are those scarlet strands of my ancestors that I'll see in the sun.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to that question, Misha, and I'm just thinking, you know, not every Native person reflects on this like the way I'm doing about joy, right? And, you know, this is my personal experience, but like reading her really like moved me to this feeling of that there is someone walking alongside me who's experiencing these same things. And I'm thinking a really dear friend of mine, she was telling me that when she first read Joy Harjo, it was at university, and she was the only Native person in her whole university. And just, you know, that can feel incredibly isolating, right? And incredibly like hard. And she discovered Joy Harjo, and it was like a life raft in many ways. And so when I read American Sunrise, I was so fortunate to be on San Juan Island. And it was this incredible trip where we got off of the ferry, and there was the most vivid rainbow I've ever seen. And later on, we saw orca relatives, and we were just like, it was just this magical trip. And I was reading the book, and my husband very wisely said, like, hey, you should try to like break it up, because he knew I could read it in like an hour and a half. So I was like, just break it up and like and let it all sink in. And it was such a wise thing to say to me, to be able to breathe it in. And it brought so much strength is what it brought to me. It brought me so much courage to keep going and inspiration to keep going on the work that I get to do.
Joy Harjo spoke about this too. And she didn't know that there were Native poets growing up. She loved poetry, but she didn't see it. She didn't see representation that made her feel like it was something that she could do. And so when she talks about that and the importance of representation and seeing Native voices and being able to to communicate in that way and to make sure that those voices are heard. She does that so beautifully. And she also, one of the things I really love about her work and how she talks about herself is thinking to the poem that Marcie started with, is that she's always learning. You know, she talks about learning the saxophone later in life and finding her voice again when it was silenced in her family by her stepfather, and also about the one of the projects she's done as U.S. Poet Laureate, which she said will be live soon, is a map of Native poets across the United States. So she's trying to make sure that other Native people see that they can be poets, and that their voices are needed and necessary.
Yeah, I can really remember understanding that there were Native writers out there. Like when I think the first non-Native author I read was Sherman Alexie, and just was blown away by the brilliance of it, and it felt like, oh, I connect to something. And that is a continued problem in our public schools, where we have so much. Our Native community is thought of as something that happened a long time ago. My kids have experienced when they're learning about, Native history, and then they identify as Native when other kids will say, oh, I thought you guys were gone like the dinosaurs, and that is a common experience of it in the Native community. So that's why representation matters so much. And we have a long ways to go. You guys have probably heard me talk about architecture. Like, we live in a city that is created by, non-Native people, and so we don't see that representation anywhere, despite this being a very Native city, right? And so when will we turn and understand that that Native art and architecture and design has to be a part of our community and planning and urban planning as we try to make things better for our whole world.
It's interesting to hear you say that, Colleen, because I grew up in Detroit, and I remember when I was a little kid learning a song about the place names in Michigan, most of which are Chippewa, and that was the largest nation in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. When I moved here, the Native communities were so much more visible. For us, it was just names, names of Washtenaw and names of places, and it wasn't. We didn't see people too much in Detroit at all. It may be different now. I've been out here for a long time, but what impressed me here was that there were living communities, and it wasn't just names. And so it seems like maybe we're on the precipice of being able to not just think about the design of urban areas, but rethink what all the people in this country have to contribute. Native people and all the many kinds of people who are citizens of the United States of America.
Yeah. I mean, I often think about what if our waterfront design here in Seattle, for instance, what if we had said, the city of Seattle has a government to government relationship with Muckleshoot and with Suquamish. And what if we had said, we want your offices to be right here on the waterfront, or we want it somewhere visibly downtown so that we can lift up your leadership and understand the knowledge and wisdom that you have to give us, and recognition of we're on your territory, and so I always think we just miss out, and because they're brilliant nations and have tremendous amount to give to this community if we'll listen, and that's where we have to get to.
I feel like it is actually starting to happen when it comes to the fires. It's I had the opportunity to interview somebody from the Colville Nation about their fire techniques, not firefighting, but and I think that ancient wisdom of how you live in a place and how humans interface with the rest of the world that we walk on, that maybe we're starting to be a little bit more receptive, or some people are more receptive to hearing ways that work.
Yeah, absolutely. We've totally veered off of poetry. It's definitely connected. I am just completely. I think that Seattle is one of the greatest cities in the world, and we have some of the best people that live here, and they're tuning into events like this. They're wanting to learn, and we have an opportunity, to be going beyond just progressive talk to progressive action, and we have to consider, what does it mean that we're on this wonderful Coast Salish territory, and we benefit so much from their land and water and other resources. So, many conversations there.
And Joy Harjo is, it's hard not to go a little astray because she brings up so much richness. Mm-hmm. And as Marcie mentioned, that there are ways in which she really takes you beyond the present moment, but she also invokes the present moment in so many of her poems. And the poem you read, Marcie, where she talks about a madman in the White House, she's not veering away from our present moment at all. She's really looking at it with clear eyes, but also more future vision than we usually see. Maybe now would be a good time for Colleen to read one of her favorite poems, For Earth's Grandsons.
First Grandsons. And if you're reading along with us in the book, it is on page 56. And I have, read this poem probably 50 times over the past couple months because I resonated with it so strongly when we consider the folks that we serve at the Chi Seattle Club, folks that have been, really suffering for way too long in our city. We know that Native people have the highest rates of homelessness around the country. And here in Seattle, it's 15% of the homeless population is American Indian, Alaska Native folks. And at the Chi Seattle Club, we are completely devoted to serving them, figuring out how to bring them back into wholeness and wellness in the ways that our ancestors did. And so this poem just resonates so deeply to the mission of the Chi Seattle Club and the individuals that we are so honored to serve. So this is called For Earth's Grandsons. Stand tall, no matter your height, how dark your skin. Your spirit is all colors within. You are made of the finest woven light. From the iridescent love that formed your mothers, fathers, your grandparents, all the way back on the spiral road, there is no end to this love. It has formed your bodies, feeds your bright spirits. And no matter what happens in these times of breaking, no matter dictators, the heartless and liars, no matter, you were born of those who kept ceremonial embers burning in their hands, all through the miles of relentless exile. Those who sang the path through massacre, all the way to sunrise. You will make it through. Just the best.
Absolutely.
Well, one of the things that this poem also really evokes is there's a quotation that she included at the very beginning of the book from Ray Youngbear, Meskwaki poet. To heal was to be familiar with what was destroyed, and holding space for both, but also saying there is love. Don't despair.
Yeah.
I'm wondering too, I'm thinking about the work you do, Marcie, in centering artists and talking about the role that art plays in our lives. How can a poem like this, how can Joy Harjo's work help Native people struggling with challenges in their lives in the midst of a very challenging time? How can poetry speak to that and help them?
At the risk of sounding like very woo-woo about it all, I think people have heard me at work get up on my soapbox, and I feel like the old movie Norma Ray, where she stands up and I think that the artists among us, poets, but all kinds of artists, are really, I think it's the highest spiritual calling, and I think that ability to conjure ourselves, to hold that mirror up to what we don't like, but also to look within. You are the light, you are love, you are these things. I think for people who are are truly, truly suffering. We're all suffering to some extent right now because these are hard times. But for people who have it harder than others, I think being able to find that sense of self-worth through these words is so important. And I think that, in a time of crisis, first of all, the artists among us in this city are amazingly resilient, and they have continued to find exciting ways, despite the fact that they have no money to do it, to really keep creating and to keep reminding us that we are more than this moment in time. And I think that is what art does. A friend of mine said, we keep one eye on the world, but one eye looking within. I think that's what art does. And I think that these words, I think that from everything I've read of Joy Harjo and listening to her speak herself, I think that what she reminds us, all of us, is that there is something beyond the present. Mm-hmm. For me.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking about like the way that she talked about like the spiral road.
Yes.
Eternal road. It keeps going and going, and it's beautiful. Well said, Marcie.
Well, it'll make me happier because I have high anxiety about the world right now. And so I'm like, try every day, take 4 deep breaths and, try to center yourself in the earth and remember that, we're all connected on the planet. And I think that's what the best poets do. They center us in the earth and the sky and the sea and remind us that we're all, kin, even if we're not, even if I'm not a blood kin of Misha and Colleen, we are human kin.
Yeah. Well, and Joy was sharing that in the interview with Oprah about how we're all related. And that's actually one way we talk about at the TCI Club all the time. That's what makes us different than other homeless service providers, is we say, these are our relatives. These are our relatives. And we're here to serve them and to love them and to remind them of who they are, that they're born of those ceremonial embers that came through the hard times. And I think that's important for all of us to remember, like there have been hard times in this world before. There have. And people have made it through. And and going back to your question, Misha, about the arts, it's like, we have to be thoughtful right now with, everyone's mental health is hard. It's not good. It's hard times. Yes. And so doing those things, going back to, the arts and going back to, I know that for myself, I don't listen to the news or his podcast as much as I usually do because it's hard to hear. So I'm listening to more music and I'm like, just diving into music more than I normally do because it's not healthy for me just to be listening to the constant, news that can be frightening.
If not frightening, it definitely makes you anxious. I think that, and Joy Harjo is also a visual artist and a musician. Yeah. And I think that she would agree that the wordless arts, in some sense, I love words. I apply them for my living. So of course I love them. But I think that there's that what I call the music of the spheres, where you she was talking about this with Oprah, that when you're writing, you are on that journey and you're caught up in the creation that you're doing. And I think as an audience member, I have a friend who said he likes to sit down and open his heart chakra at a performance and just let it, feel it and let it carry you around, because in a sense that's the highest form of communion, is to recognize yourself through the art. So the art is a conduit to that. And I think for me, Joy Harjo's poetry is that conduit to something beyond the immediate. Like the poem that Colleen just read made me get all teary because I think, it feels so real,
Yeah.
Open.
Well, it's also a poem that really is reaching out to those Native relatives that Colleen invokes, that they are continually bombarded with stories that, as Joy Harjo would say, diminish them. And she is trying to create space where they can see that they are loved and that the embers that their ancestors have carried, they did it out of love and they are still with them.
Yeah.
And I wonder about how are you meeting people and helping them connect with some of that feeling in your work, Colleen?
Yeah, I know. I love the part too about those who, like she says, those ancestors who sang their way through the massacre, and we got together a couple weeks ago, me and some of the staff, and we actually sang some of the songs that you heard at the beginning of this with this event. And that was so healing for me, even though it only took us like 10 minutes. We kept planning and never worked through it. And we're like, let's just do it. And it took us 10 minutes, and we sang those songs, and it felt so good and so grounding. And that is the work that we do at the Chi Seattle Club, is helping our Native relatives reconnect to who they are as Native people, to offer them resources that make sense. We're spending a lot of time right now asking our folks to reconnect to traditional medicines and traditional foods. So we have staff that we're paying right now to like prepare traditional medicines, and we're buying those traditional medicines from our relatives out in Indian country, and we're doing a lot of work on traditional foods. So we're asking, we're buying wild rice from Minnesota for our relatives who are from Minnesota, and all of those things help bring comfort, help bring stability. And our homeless relatives right now across the city, whether you're Native or non-Native, this is a hard time. Many of our day centers are not open the way they used to be. Our day center certainly isn't. Many of our congregate shelters are shut down. Folks are being, our encampments that are getting, are not always safe or not always great. And so there's just it's a hard time for our homeless community. So we're trying to offer as much comfort and solace as we can with the very limited way that we can interact. We got to keep our staff safe. And that's all. It's a very hard time for all of us, but especially for our homeless community.
Yeah. As we see the cold and the wet coming on as well. It's really worrisome. And so to go back to the question, Misha, about what art can do in the face of those circumstances, I think all it can do is to remind you that you have a right to be. You have a right to exist.
Yeah.
And that, somebody's singing your heart song.
Yeah.
That's beautiful, Marcie. I also took that away when Joy Harjo last week chose a section of her memoir to read, and she read about her son-in-law who had a really hard life and was and died in a really horrible way. But she talked about intergenerational trauma, but she also spoke about someone struggling with so much love and so much care and no judgment.
Yeah.
And we don't see that a lot. I think that's another thing that she does, and that what art that is connected does is really helps people be.
It's interesting that you bring up judgment, because we're pretty judgy. And I'm talking about like not just the US culture, but we're just judgy. Humans are judgy, and we have polarized ourselves so much at this point in time that I heard somebody calling out, like, what do you wish for this country no matter what happens in the election? And I guess I wish for us to be less judgy and more loving. And it just sounds so ridiculous in the face of people who are suffering on the streets. But I think if we have to open that door a little bit and be less judgy to be able to actually help people who really need help.
Yeah.
Central to this, conversation too, is that for those of us who in some of our work serve some of the most vulnerable among us, we are continually fighting to defend their humanity and trying to shift the narrative about who they are and just the circumstances they're in. What are some of the things that you wish more people knew about your members, Colleen, and about the homeless and insecurely housed in Seattle?
Yeah. What comes to mind right away is just how funny they are. I have been continuously impressed with our members of the Chi Seattle Club who they'll come in after a really hard night, have been slept outside, slept in a cabin, or maybe just wandered around and they're tired and they're looking for a warm place just to rest. And when they come in our doors, they meet up with their friends, and it's just this feeling of like camaraderie and joy and so much laughing, so many jokes going on. In Indian country, we often talk about part of our resiliency has been humor. There is some hilarious Native people out there, and there's lots of jokes and lots of personal jokes back and forth with each other, and that's just part of the resilient community. And that's what I love that about our members. I love how brilliant they are, and I say this a lot that we have such a crisis of homelessness and so many people experiencing homelessness at any one night. And I often think about if those folks were brought into stability, what would they offer us as a community? Like, what kind of brilliant ideas do they have that we're looking for, but their voice can't be heard? They don't have the time to think, because it's very hard to be homeless. As you know, it takes up a lot of time to try to find the right resources. And so I just want people to know how brilliant our members of the Chi Seattle Club are, our wonderful relatives, how much they have to offer us, and how much the solutions that they hold in their hands if we just get them into stability and get them into housing.
Joy Harjo's story too is connected here, because when she talks about her mother and that her mother married someone who basically stifled her voice, and that there was no music in her house, and she was also a singer. You can see the ways in which some of the voices and some of those contributions, the people that are wonderful and happy and joyful and hilarious, are stifled and stopped, and that her triumph can be anyone's, but she's been through hard times and she made it to the other side. Marcie, you have thoughts?
10 U.S. poet laureates who are Native. I always think about what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said about the Supreme Court. She's like, well, when all of us are women, then
exactly.
Well, why don't I think the next 10 U.S. poet laureates should be Native people.
Well, as you were talking, both of you, I was thinking about a woman that I had the honor to profile. Oh gosh, it's at least 10 years ago. An Alaskan Native who had been taken from her family and sent to a boarding school in Minnesota, I believe, and then aged out of that boarding school, and there was no plan for her, right? And she had lost a piece of paper with the contact information for her family. So she didn't have that. Yeah. And she was sleeping under a bush. And this woman rose to be a professor at Evergreen and worked for the state of Washington. And she was a traditional weaver. She wove with grasses, the things that she remembered that her aunties had taught her when she was a girl. And so her resilience and her spirit, and what she had to give, what she had to teach me in the conversations that we had about holding to yourself and what you felt like you were here for, was so powerful. And I would imagine, Colleen, that you have dozens of stories like that.
Yeah.
With all the members who come through the doors.
Oh, so many beautiful stories and so much knowledge and so much, brilliance around all kinds of mechanisms and ways that we should be understanding the world. So yeah, it'll be interesting as, the way becomes clearer. We have greater representation all the time. And we have just amazing journey ahead of us as Native community, where I think that the more our stories are told, the more people understand, the more way we make in the community and leadership and other places. And we will see the next 10 be Native people as U.S. Poet Laureates. It's a wonderful journey ahead.
Well, you mentioned Tracy Rector, who last week spoke to Joy Harjo, and Tracy uses her art form to tell stories in some amazing ways. And I hope people have an opportunity, if they haven't seen her work, to find her. She's a poet of a different kind, a poet of film and storytelling, and just really some of the work that she's doing with virtual reality films and putting you inside a world that is not your own, but that you can be immersed in, is so powerful and really a different way of listening to people whose stories you might not know, but perhaps you'd be interested to hear. I mean, that's been my great fortune, is to have people tell me their stories. You know, it's the best part about my work. So there's a lot of stories, and more storytellers, the better, I'd say.
You know, and back to this book real quick. One of the things that blew me away, I love showing people this. I've just been reading it, is that I don't think I would call myself a big reader of poetry. Like, I have occasionally, and it's just not the genre that I have been drawn to. But the thing about this book, when you read it cover to cover, is that it tells a beautiful story. Like, it tells the story of Joy's grandfather and her ancestors, and then moves on to, what it's like to turn 70 and what's going on in this community. I just want to invite, everyone out there who maybe doesn't read poetry, like, this is a wonderful place to start. Like, I'm hungry for more poetry. And I've now picked up other poems of Joy's as sort of like life, guiding lights in this, interesting journey that we're all on right now.
It's an interesting beat that's happening someplace.
Yeah, that is the radiator in my office. Weirdly
I like it.
Sorry.
I thought maybe somebody who was like kind of, in the other world, adding a little rhythm to your call out. I think I have shelves, you can't see them behind me, filled with poetry, because I find that the poets, probably the least appreciated of all of our artists are the poets. They're really happy if they sell like 5,000 copies of a book. That's, not very much in the world of publishing. And yet they're able to distill our emotions and our hopes and all of that in these ways that are like jewels. It's like, right? It's like when somebody cuts a diamond so it shines. That's what poets do with words. It's really amazing to me.
So we have a question from the audience, which is, how is Chief Seattle Club promoting wellness through art right now?
Oh, a wonderful question. One of our longest running programs is our art program. So we've had 20 years of an art program that continues to thrive. We've had many wonderful leaders in that program. And so with COVID happening, though, it's hard to our art room has always been open every day for folks to come down and do all kinds of art classes or, open studios. But how do we translate that in COVID? And so our brilliant team came up with little art packets, which is awesome. Like they did everything from like little coloring books to bead kits, with everything you might need to like bead some earrings or bead something else. They came up with just brilliant ways to support our artists out there, and also therapeutically, right? Like, art is so good for the soul, good for us moving towards wellness. And so our program has continued. We also use our Native Works team to be continuing to support art and support artists. So if you look at our Chief Seattle Club website and then hit our Native Works link, you can see all the art that we're making and selling as well. So really great question. We continue to support and love our relatives as they are struggling out on the street and without the support of being able to come into our day center by taking it directly to them. So great question. Thank you.
Well, we are almost ready to close. So I just wanted to invite both of you to share any of your last thoughts about An American Sunrise and what it means to you.
Oh, I think, well, first of all, I want to thank you, Colleen and Misha, again, for inviting me to participate and to give me one whole hour to talk about poetry. I can't think of anything I would like more. I think that what I'm going to take away from this, besides, having all these rereading, because unlike Colleen, I didn't gobble it all up. I kind of read it in pieces, is that sense of breath, of sitting back, taking a deep breath and moving forward, appreciating the work that Colleen and Misha and everybody does, and just trying to hold patience if the world doesn't, things don't happen my way. And just trying to be patient and know that life is long and the journey will continue.
Yeah, I just want to say the same to you, Marcie, and Misha. Thank you so much for being a part of this. It's been wonderful and life-giving, and I think that all of us are better for this, for having a discussion like this. So thank you, and thanks to Joy Harjo for her bravery. For I think she was saying she was like in pre-med, I believe, and then changed her whole career towards poetry. And it has brought so much life and healing to so many. So I'm so grateful for that courageous act. I think it's something for us all to think about, like, those longings of our own heart to do something in the arts. And maybe it seems hard and crazy, but that's that crazy brave mentality that Joy has. So I'm really grateful for Joy. And I think I just want to finish up with reading the very end of the poem, How to Write a Poem in Time of War. This is what Joy's writing to all of us is right now, I think. He knew one day, far away, the grandchildren would return. Generations later, over slick highways, constructed over old trails, through walls of law meant to hamper or destroy, over stones bearing libraries of the winds. He sang us back to our home place from which we were stolen in these smoky green hills. Yes, begin here. Thank you all.
Thank you. And thank you, Colleen and Marcie. Happy 50th anniversary, Chief Seattle Club.
Yes.
And what an amazing slate of programming, always Indigenous, brought together. Thanks for inviting us to be a part of it.
Thank you all. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
It has. Thank you.
Yay! Thank you guys so much. This is so fun. We appreciate you. And I'm looking forward to the future of what happens. Everyone needs to stay calm.
Breathe. Take a deep breath. I'll reread some of these poems next week.
Yeah.
While I need it.